Here we go. So I'm MacMillan, CTO at Prattle. We're US based. We have offices in Boston, New York, and St. Louis. In the big picture, what we do is automate traditional financial research. We find areas where basically it hasn't been quantified yet. People haven't been doing the dirty work to change things that you have to sit and have a human do and quantify in some way and use that to make actual actionable decisions from. We find those spaces and we take them over with computers and let the robots rule the world kind of stuff. One of the exciting things about being in Prattle in sort of position right now actually has a lot to do with global finance and a lot of the challenges that financial services industry on the capital market side is facing. Specifically, there's a regulatory change happening in Europe referred to as MiFID II. Specifically, what's happening is that investment banks now have to tell their clients how much they're spending on research. Previously, nobody knew that fact, how much money was being spent on research, and all of a sudden, hedge funds, asset managers are saying, why are we spending this much money on this? And moreover, the research that's usually provided on the sell side by investment banks and other research boutique firms, the vast majority of it's not read. Something on the order of only 3% of research that's sent out to clients is even clicked on, right? That's not counting read. So we're talking about thousands upon millions of different research reports on companies, assets, political events, all kinds of things. Nobody literally is even touching remotely. Moreover, the manner in which this research is produced that nobody's reading is been almost the exact same, for certain, for 100 years, and arguably probably since the Medicis decided to call it interest instead of bursary or something in the 1600s. Essentially, the process is you hire analysts, they sit down and they learn everything they can about some area, and then when a new piece of information comes out, whether it's new financials, statements from C-suite members, talk from central banks, they still sit and write a report about it and have some subjective, read the tea leaves kind of take on it. And as I mentioned, you could actually go look up buy, sell, hold ratings from 100 years ago. So you can get the exact same sort of results from research that you would have seen centuries ago, literally. What we do is we take all of that information that analysts were previously processing in their own mental models, and we actually create systems that automatically quantify that and make it so that you can actually take actionable you can have actionable decisions made off of this data in a really direct way. We start off by finding particular pieces of information that we know are market moving. So our very first product, in fact, tracks central banks. So we tracked the Fed, ECB, Bank of Japan, and then went through within those particular subset areas and built systems that were tuned very specifically to that system, to that application, right? And so I mentioned before we started with central banks. So we built a specific NLP and sentiment algorithm very directly for the Fed, and then for the ECB, and then for the Bank of Japan. And then we've actually then scaled that out when we're moving into corporate communications to around 4,000 domestic stocks in the U.S. And we're actually going to be adding internationally to somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000 in the next 6 to 12 months. The context-specific algorithms then are used to actually score and evaluate new pieces of information as they come in, and then produce results that are actionable at the end of it. So really, the idea with our system is an earnings call happens. Janet Yellen gives a speech. You don't need to read anything even. You can just look at this number and say it's a 3. That means I should go buy something, right? The industry and the investors that are out there are really recognizing a need for this right now, especially as I mentioned with MiFID II happening. So with incredible cost pressures all of a sudden showing up at investment banks, and then also hedge fund clients looking for both ways to save money, but then also ways to generate alpha, right, to increase their performance. We're seeing incredible traction with people that are interested in these spaces, and then investors are also recognizing this fact. Probably the most notable on the investor side, not that it's well known actually, but GCM Grosvenor Capital Management is actually one of the largest fund of funds in the world, right? So they're an asset management group that actually funds hedge funds. So our lead investor is somebody with that direct look into the hedge fund world, specifically because they know that this is where the future is going. One of the interesting things about the change in technology here is that the sort of the recipients of it, right, the people that we're actually directly analyzing are themselves also recognizing this is where the future is and this is what's going to be impactful. So, like I mentioned, we started off tracking the Fed very specifically, and the Fed actually then sort of flipped the microscope around and looked to see how well the scores actually reflect the reality as they see it. In fact, the Fed itself has directly expressed that our data basically predicts their policy before they even themselves can do it. When we moved from central banks, which was, like I said, our sort of first big push, we now track 20 different central banks globally. We do so essentially on a real-time basis. So within seconds of when a communication is available, we process it and make it available to our clients. The next big push for us then was moving in the direction of equities. And as we were building up that partnership, or that product, we ended up partnering with NASDAQ, in both on the central bank product and then now on the equity product as well. With NASDAQ's new analytics hubs, they actually have sort of a data buffet style analytics hub where there's a huge amount of results in terms of analytics, but also a big number of constituent data sets. Prattle is actually one of the 4 cornerstone data providers in that new analytics hub. Part of the reason we sort of made that vetting process was because exactly as the Fed found, exactly as other actors have found, this gets you to where you want to be in terms of actual results, much better than anybody else. The basic approach it's a fairly boutique take on NLP and sentiment analysis. So the fundamental idea is taking language that you'd see from speeches, from press releases, from earnings calls, and actually creating a domain-specific version of an algorithm so that you can actually extract the specific quantities of interest you want in that area. So central banking is sort of an easy one in a sense, right? It's easy because you want to know where monetary policy is going. You want to know what the Fed or the central bank is going to say about the actual domestic economy or national economy. And you want to be able to parse that, and you believe you can parse it from the language of the text that's coming out, right? Now, specifically in this case, what people have done, instead of trying to, they've had 2 approaches. One is sort of take an off-the-shelf sentiment analysis algorithm, which tends to actually perform poorly, or they don't change anything they've been doing for the last 100 years. They pay people to sit around and read them, and they write reports, right? With our method, though, it's designed to zero in on that dimension in the language. It's not just happy or sad like you might get from a sentiment analysis algorithm. It's specifically what does this language say about monetary policy? What does this language say about how economies are going to react, what markets are going to do? What you end up finding then is that put into practice, this data easily outperforms any actors that you'll see in the market that are making similar kind of predictions, right? So this graph here specifically is in reference to monetary policy predictions, right? So consensus in terms of predicting a hike, a cut, or a hold is around 90% over the same time period. So May 2016 to May 2017. Over that 12-month period, Prattle we made 2 slip-ups, right? So specifically, we called incorrectly with everybody else the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and then we called incorrectly, I guess everyone, incorrectly, but then I guess everyone as well, Australia. During that same time period, you can see a number of events where we actually were going against consensus and then was right. And moreover, the people that are getting this wrong are not sort of people that are just writing blogs, right? This is Merrill Lynch, This is Goldman Sachs. This is all of the biggest financial actors in the world that have literally millions of dollars, billions of dollars engaged in this space are not outperforming what we do. And in the case of us doing it, there's this guy, Graham, he's 21. He looks at the scores and then writes some notes and sends them to Evan. Right? That's our entire process. So with really minimal resources applied above and beyond what our systems put out, you can very easily see increases in performance above and beyond what anybody else in the world is going to see. Just a couple of specific examples. July 29th, 2016, you can see the best part about this one is actually just who got it wrong, right? So Nomura, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, Royal Bank of Canada, Morgan Stanley, the entire list, right? In most of these cases, the one I know best personally is actually the Bank of England one, which is immediately following Brexit, right? So in that scenario, there was specifically Mark Carney gave a speech, who runs the Bank of England, gave a speech where there was this language in the sort of introduction and the conclusion that made it sound sort of dovish, like they were going to cut rates, right? And everybody, top to bottom, obviously including these actors that we list here, but then in the public media and things like that, we're saying we're definitely going to see a change in interest rates pretty much immediately following Brexit. And our system actually evaluated that speech as being kind of hawkish, which means that probably not going to see a change in monetary policy. I was actually called up on the rug for this. They're like, Bill, what did your system do? I sat there and be like, well, it works. Just read the number. And so we actually reviewed the data in a lot of detail and literally reviewed the performance of the system because this was so against consensus, and could not help but come to the conclusion that rates are going to be held in this next meeting, which is in fact exactly what happened. Let's see here. And the Carney one specifically, this is more on that example. Part of what's valuable about this is really the idea of the computer being a method to actually eliminate your own personal biases as you're looking at a specific document, right? Now, Brexit, again, is a great example for this because you're specifically in this scenario where, the sky is falling, right? Everybody's perceiving this as to be a huge negative economic impact to the domestic markets in the UK. And the thought process says there's no way this is good at all, right? And so that sort of shadow looming over all of the analysis that was done at that point in time made it so that as the analysts were actually reading the communications, they picked up on these very specific negative things and went in the direction of saying, well, this is actually what it's about. The system, on the other hand, though, it doesn't care, doesn't know about the sky falling. It just sort of is a server in Virginia, and it just cranks through it and does what it does, right? As I mentioned, in the actual speech itself, that was sort of the cornerstone for our evaluation in this context. It really was 2 or 3 specific sentences in the midst of what was effectively a half-hour-long speech, right? And people, because of their own biases in the scenario, picked up on those specific sentences and said, this is what's really happening. But if you actually then systematically look through the rest of the document, it was easy to see those were in fact outliers. Everything else was quite moderate. So as mentioned, as we moved on from central banking, and as we were in the market with that initially, we actually found a pretty massive gap between what people's capacities were to do the things that is being touted in the news of what machine learning and data science is doing for the financial services industry, and what the actual on the ground position is of many of these companies. We moved into analyzing corporate communications, so as I mentioned, press releases, publicly available transcripts of C-suite members discussing the company, things in the news, things of that nature. We moved into that direction actually because of our clients asking for it directly. It was not precisely on our radar as we wandered into it. It's sort of one thing in a list of things that had to be kind of interesting to do. We moved specifically in this direction because as we got into discussions with our clients, for as much as there is in the news and the public perception of NLP and machine learning and data science having sort of revolutionized the finance industry in this space, there was really little that was actionable, right? There was really little that was done in a systematic, deployed at a production level, day in, day out, it's in a database kind of level. Most of the work that's out there in this context, it's usually one-off papers, right? Somebody says, oh, we could use machine learning here. So they write a little report, and it sort of gets thrown into the mix and disappears from there. So the next step then was, all right, let's find places where our technology that we developed for the central bank context carries directly over into corporate communications. So the first place we went to was earnings calls. So in most countries, or most companies globally, and then very specifically in the United States, once a quarter you have to have a call with shareholders and analysts describing the health of your company. You have to publicly, because you're a public company, right? You have to publicly go out there and confront the people that own your company and say what's happening, right? In terms of the status quo, what happens is you have a small subset of analysts that actually sit and study those things, right? They read them or they're in on the calls, and then they update the reports and they update their ratings based on that, right? So what you find is that in most cases, the gap between the human issues you have and then the actual performance of the stock, and the gap between when the call actually happens and when people can act on that data coming out of analyst reports, both of those are huge, right? Specifically, the thing with this example is we're noting here, September 24th through the 15 call. The specifics in this case, it's worth noting. The Bloomberg report actually came out sort of well after the fact. Is that in a sense that was actually quite a bit against consensus leading up to it in terms of the actual guidance of it. And then at the moment of the call, you can see the big upswing in price right following it. But it's an effect that took time, right? Whereas our system immediately picked that up and went in that direction. So as a practical matter, you can then aggregate this because it's unbiased on a company by company basis. You can aggregate this to a sector, to a whole economy level, right? Basically, so the XLI, it's overweight industrial, so it's actually an ETF, so like an exchange traded fund that you can buy into, and specifically supposed to reflect an entire sector of the economy. And performance then, in terms of your position on this, is heavily related to, what's happening at all the constituent inputs of that sector, right? And our scores easily aggregate up to that, allowing for both sort of micro level investments that are improvements, so you can buy a single company, or you can actually invest at the market level. So far I've really concentrated on performance, and this is sort of where the MiFID II thing comes back in, right? So the interesting challenge with MiFID really is on the cost-cutting side. We've had discussions with a number of investment banks, and probably the average number of analysts that are going to be cut over the next couple of years is half to 2/3 in a lot of these large industries, or large banks. So covering a traditional equity right now costs about $55,000 per company. So in the U.S. alone, there's about 4,000 publicly traded companies. So what happens is that most companies don't get covered, right? Most publicly traded companies globally have 0 analysts covering them, so nobody's literally watching them at all. And the median number in the U.S. is 0, and it's not until you get above the top 500 or 600 stocks that you even get analysts regularly tracking them at all, right? Moving from there, if you go down the chain, like I said, you just have nothing, and then up to Apple where you have hundreds, but that's literally only a few companies in the world that are getting that kind of focus on them. The idea with the Prattle data is you can use this with your traditional analyst base and actually highly increase the number any one analyst can cover, using our data essentially as a filter, what's coming in that's actually worthwhile to look at. The last couple parts of this in terms of, I'm running out of time here, I'm getting rushed. The other things worth noting sort of related to that really is what's the position of a fund, of an asset manager relative to their investors, relative to their fiduciary responsibility, right? Since, as I mentioned, the rubber meets the road of this is that all of these technologies that people think are in the market are not there yet. Prattle really represents the new status quo in terms of machine learning, NLP applied to financial services. there's sort of two dimensions. One is, attracting investors to your fund, attracting money to your fund. In that case, quant obviously being sort of, the now of what needs to happen. The fiduciary responsibility being the last part, which is, again, sort of tied to marketing essentially, but what it really boils down to is that essentially, funds are no longer in a position to ignore these kind of opportunities, right? Because of the regulatory pressure, because of the cost-cutting pressure, because of all these different things, they specifically, in order to protect their investor money, need to be buying into businesses and technologies like this. The overall sort of story of what Prattle is doing is, we're responding to market pressure, to regulatory pressure, providing a product that is really built on current day technologies, but actually makes it really directly actionable like no one else in the market currently. The question was, who are our competitors? It sort of depends on what scale you're looking at. Probably in the U.S., one of the most direct ones is a company called Ravenpack. They provide sentiment analysis more broadly, mostly based off news or social media. So other companies like Icentium, we're similar kind of construct, which is sort of what's the broader news coming out of things. Alternately, sort of on a bigger scale, you can argue that some of our competitors are things like the investment banks themselves, right? So, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, they produce this research, and their research can be seen as sort of a direct competitor. What we're finding in practice is that the banks are not viewing us as a competitor; they're viewing us as a partner and potential tool to actually improve their own performance internally. What's our biggest strength? Against them, I think honestly we're cheaper. We're a small company. We're nimble. We can produce what we want to produce at a much lower cost, and frankly, still have it outperform the existing systems that are out there. So, because it's cheaper, you can make it more broad. You can attack way more angles to things. You can generate novel versions of it much more quickly. Whereas the existing model in the investment banks, particularly themselves, it's built on human analysts reading things, which is inherently not a scalable proposition.
My understanding is that your BOJ analysis is done both in English and in Japanese.
So the scores currently in our system are singularly the English language versions of them. We do run versions for all languages, but we only sell the English language versions one. Primarily, we run them simultaneously to check if there is any significant difference between the English and Japanese versions. What we found in practice is that there doesn't tend to be much. The only real difference is there's a slight shading one direction, usually sort of dovish, in the Japanese language one in particular, because the idea is that there's some subtle language choices being undertaken specifically to sort of make domestic Japanese investors feel better about holding Japanese debt.
So my question was on the two scores where you were contrary to consensus but correct on the BOJ. Was that true both in the English and in the Japanese analytics, or have you ever seen it on the borderline?
It was actually. It's very rare that. Looking through the data, I think through the data streams, we've never really seen a significant difference in terms of slope. They're sort of, what happens is they move in concert with each other. There's sort of an intercept shift between them a little bit. And both in the Japanese language and the English language versions of it, this was, our calls that we made in the BOJ case were very apparent. It was a clear, here's what the BOJ is saying, and it's taking a nosedive towards dovish, right? And it didn't really matter whether it was English or Japanese.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.